Hi, if you like the video, please remember to subscribe. Hi, I'm Rob from robnunphoto.com, and this is my tutorial about how to take sharper and better photographs with your Canon digital SLR. Although when I say Canon digital SLR, the techniques and sort of settings we're going to be talking about in the video don't really just apply to your Canon DSLR. It could be any make, whether it be sort of Sony, Nikon, Pentax. It could be a film SLR, such as my little Canon EOS 600 there. It could be medium format, it could be compacts, because lots of the ways that we can look at how we can try and take sharper photographs apply to many aspects of photography and videography as well. Now, this is one of my first longer form videos, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm actually using a piece of paper just to the left of the camera as kind of an auto prompt so I can remember what to say. But what I'm going to do is break up the video into sections. It's going to be one long video, but you'll see it's fade out and fade in again as I kind of change my notes so I can try and remember everything. And if there's things I do miss out, or maybe there's techniques that you've come across that you think, oh yeah, that really helps, then email me, scalespeeder@gmail.com, or visit robnunphoto.com, that's ROBNUNNPHOTO.com, and send me a message from there. So the first thing I would say is, do you really need to worry about taking sharper photographs with your DSLR? You're probably in auto mode at the moment, or maybe program, or maybe one of the automatic exposure modes like Aperture priority and everything. But you know, have a good look at your photographs. Often, as photographers, we kind of get caught up in the technical side of things, and we confuse the fact that we need to get everything super technically perfect. You know, every photo needs to be tack sharp. We need to zoom in to 100% at our monitors and have a look at them. And that's not what makes a great photograph. You go through any collection of great photographs from the 20th or the 21st century, and I guarantee you that 90% of them aren't tack sharp. The famous landscape photographer Ansel Adams says there's nothing worse than a sharp photo of a fuzzy concept. And you can lose spontaneity as well if you're so bothered by the technique and settings in your camera. You know, if you're out and about with moving subjects or sports or news, you know, by sort of having to stop and think about it, or being too bothered that a photo that's slightly out of focus isn't that good, then you're going to lose some of the magic of photography as well. Saying that though, if you've moved from a compact to a digital SLR, or from a bridge camera to a digital SLR, one of the things that I found very disappointing was how easy it was to take a blurred photo with an SLR. Your digital SLR doesn't look after you like your compacts and your bridge cameras do. I know my old little Fuji S5700 all sorts of warnings would appear in the viewfinder and on the back of the camera if your shutter speed was too slow, and it looked like you're going to get a blurry image. And I found, you know, for probably the first year of using my digital SLR, that I was getting a lot more duff shots, you know, really blurry photos than I ever did with my old compact one. So you don't need to be shooting in auto. It's very easy to move on to the more advanced modes, and a lot easier than you think. So the other thing probably is this guide, you could probably also talk about it as a guide to getting the most potential out of your DSLR, and setting you on that course where you're going to practice some of these techniques and some of these things that you can do. And the whole idea of it is making them second nature, so you don't have to think about them. So you don't have to think about how your shutter speed or your aperture or your ISO might affect how blurry a photo might turn out. And because if we can understand these techniques, we can then move on and really concentrate on things like maybe the moment of the photograph, which the scene we're trying to capture, or other things to making artistic decisions like composition, or, you know, light, or what the subject is. So there's a number of things that can be said to make a photo sharp. These include accuracy of focus, depth of field, camera shake, subject movements, how good the quality of your lens is, how your camera is set up, what sort of post-processing you do. And in this video we're kind of going to look at all of those things, some more than others. And the idea is that at the end you'll probably go away with some things that you can practice and put into action sort of straight away to get sharper photos. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start off with something probably a little bit controversial. If you're wondering and you're questioning how sharp the photos can be that you're going to get out of your camera, I'm going to suggest something a little bit left field. I'm going to say shoot in JPEG mode. Don't shoot in RAW. Now, I know there's lots of people out there on the internet who scream and shout about shooting in RAW and how important it is to shoot in RAW, because then you can get the most amount of quality and the most amount of data out of your photographs. But the problem with shooting in RAW is that you are literally getting a raw image from the sensor and the camera. Don't confuse it with like a negative from the days of film. Because with a negative from film, that film had been developed probably over many years to add things like colour and saturation and lack of grain, so you could argue that could be seen as apparent sharpness as well. When you took the photo, so when you got it developed, that was there. But with a raw image from your camera, lots of those things haven't been applied. So things like colour correction or punch, contrast, that sort of stuff, and also normally with your raw images, sharpening won't have been applied by the camera. And what that means is that there's this other level of not inaccuracy, but you can't tell how sharp the images could be coming out of your camera if you're subject to the amount of sharpening you're going to be adding in post-processing. So what I'm going to suggest is shoot for the purposes of learning about our cameras, and maybe for a time afterwards, shoot in JPEG. Look in the manual for your camera and see how you can turn it to JPEG fine. So you use the least compressed form of JPEG with the biggest files that give you the best quality. And then the other thing I'm going to suggest you do is that, for example, in my 450D, if I go into the menus and then go into the parameters, sorry, 450D, 350D, what I tend to shoot in is parameter 1, where I add a little bit of contrast, one stop of contrast, not as in an f-stop, but as in on the screen, and one stop of sharpness, and then I leave saturation and colour tone alone. And that way we're going to have like this base images of JPEGs that are going to be coming out of our camera, so that when you do look at them on your computer, if you want to judge how sharp they are, it's not going to be dependent on how much sharpening you add in post-processing. So again, have a look in your manual, make sure you can set that up, and once you're happy with your technique and you know the level of sharpness to expect from your camera and the subjects you shoot, then move on to RAW. Then move on to taking it. Lots of people say using RAW takes it to the next level. But one sort of little thing I would add on, if you're a sports shooter where you're going to be shooting hundreds and hundreds of photos, or a wedding shooter, do you really need to shoot RAW? Just something to think about, because JPEGs, are easy to share. Your camera tends to work quicker when you're using JPEGs, and there's less post-processing, so that's really good. So first things first, let's go real back to basics now. Let me grab my camera bag, and what we're going to do now is we're just going to look up a little bit of really basic camera setup. So the first thing to do, let's make sure our lens is clean, let's make sure our viewfinder is clean, and our LCD screen is clean on the back. Now remember, whenever you're cleaning your lens and your viewfinder and the LCD screen, use separate cloths. Don't use the same one to do both. This is a tip I picked up off Frono's Photo, because when you're taking photos and you're head is up against the camera, you're putting all your oils from your skin and your hair all over the back of your camera. That will then get saturated into this lens cloth, which you then put on the front. You don't really want those oils going on the front of your lens. So give everything a nicely clean, especially, you know, your viewfinder, because you're going to be looking through that, so that when we look at these things, we can actually see what we're doing. You'd be surprised at how filthy people's viewfinders can be. Now, I know we're going to be relying on autofocus for taking our photos, but there's nothing wrong with having a base setting where we can actually see what we're getting. And related to that as well, which is incredibly important, especially when you switch over to manual focusing, is your diopter setting, which is this little wheel here on my 350D. And what that does is it adjusts the viewfinder to whether I might be short-sighted or long-sighted. And the way you tend to set them up is you defocus your camera, put it in manual focus, defocus it so it's not focused on anything particular, then look at the little automatic focus points, you know, those little boxes you see on the screen, and then just turn it till you see them at their sharpest. So you get, again, we've set up a camera, so we're giving ourselves this baseline which we can then build on, so we're not starting on kind of false assumptions. The other thing that I always like to do with my cameras before I'm going to do any shooting at all is a simple checklist called the wife checklist. Because although sometimes when we're thinking about sharp photos, it's all about the things that we do to our camera. It's also about the things we forget to do to our camera. In other words, we leave it on a setting from maybe the last time we went out shooting that isn't appropriate to what we're doing now. By using a checklist to start off with, we can make sure that doesn't happen. So the wife checklist basically stands for white balance, ISO, focus and exposure. So I know white balance doesn't really affect sharpness, but I go through white balance. So what's my white balance set to? Automatic white balance, cool, that's fine. ISO, now ISO can affect sharpness because ISO is how sensitive your camera is to light. So the less sensitive it is to light, the longer the shutter speed will be because it needs more light to go into it. So you could get camera or subject blur. And so my base ISO that I tend to use all the time on a normal sunny day is 200, or if it's a little bit cloudy, I go up to 400. And then we're going to talk about that a little bit later about how we can affect that. So I'll set it to 200. And again, the reason for checking that is you may have been shooting in darker conditions where you had your ISO up at 1600 or 3200, which is fine, but you get more noisy images of that. You don't get the best quality out of your camera. And then what happens is when you're shooting at like ISO 3200, 1600 or 6400, your camera automatically applies a certain amount of noise reduction, and that can sort of soften the photos as well. So just make sure that's there. Focusing, so is my camera lens set to autofocus, which it is, and then what you can also do is check your AF mode. So you've probably got on my 350D, for example, we've got one shot, we've got AO focus and AO servo. Again, I'm going to talk about those a little bit more in a minute, but for most purposes, one shot is what we're going to be using, so that we select one shot so that when we go to focus, we press the shutter button halfway down, and the camera will lock on, make a beep probably, and then we can take our picture. Now, exposure. Now for me, exposure, what I'm looking at here is what mode I'm in on the camera. So for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to be shooting in aperture priority mode, AV mode, because that gives us control of the size of the hole in our front of our lens. And also check whether your exposure, you probably can't see this, but whether your exposure compensation is in the middle. So have a look at your manual what exposure compensation is, and basically what you can do is, as you know, is when you're in the automatic modes like automatic program, aperture priority, shutter priority mode, when you go to take a picture in aperture priority mode anyway, you choose the hole in the front of the camera, and the camera then selects the correct shutter speed to match to give you an acceptable exposure. But you might be in a situation, say in the snow or in the desert or on a dark evening, where you've got to say to the camera, actually you're taking these photos and you're making them a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark. So that's where you use exposure compensation to darken or lighten the photo. So just make sure that that's in the middle, because your camera will probably remember where it was from the last time you were shooting. And there you've completed the wife checklist. Get yourself into the habit of doing this every single time, because you'd be amazed at the number of things you'll read on forums and the like, where people went out to shoot something maybe quite important, and then started firing away, but didn't realise their camera was set on the wrong white balance, or they had ISO 1600 in it, and their photos came up too grainy, too noisy, or they had it their automatic focus button, it was on manual focus, and they didn't realise. All these little things can really affect it. And by doing the wife checklist, we're kind of zeroing everything down and starting from a good base to build on the quality of our photographs. Okay, let's start off with focusing. Seems simple, but it's very easy to get it wrong unless we know what our camera is doing. Now, we've already done our wife checklist, so we've selected autofocus, we've selected one-shot focusing, and the other thing that we need to check, actually I forgot from my wife focus as well, is the autofocus point that we've selected. Again, have a look in your manual, look for autofocus points, because this again is another really simple one, because what you want to do is you want to know where your camera is going to select to autofocus, and you want it to be in the middle. So on the 350D, for example, what you do is you press that button there, and then using the kind of buttons on the back, you can select which autofocus point. Now, this is a really old camera, so it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It only has 7 autofocus points, but one's kind of all the way over here, one's all the way over there, one's down there, one's down there. So if you've got the wrong autofocus point selected, you're trying to focus at somebody who's in the middle of your photo, and the camera's focusing on somebody who's behind it, sort of 50 feet away, so your main subject is going to be blurred. So make sure you check and you go for the central autofocus point. Another reason why we're going to be going for the central autofocus point is that it gives us probably the most accurate focusing, because it's the outside ones can sometimes not use phase detection in the same way that the centre one does. We're also going to be using a technique called focus and recompose, which we're going to talk about. So, how do we take a sharp photo? How do we make sure we do it? Well, all we do is we know we've selected the centre focus point. We just get our camera, look through the lens, press the button halfway down, the shutter button halfway down, and what happens then is the camera then goes, right, I'm going to focus. And it will use its phase detection methods, or contrast detection methods, if it's a compact or a bridge camera or a mirrorless camera, and then it will focus on what's in the middle, and then you'll normally get a beep. Now, once you've got that beep, it's important at that point then that you don't move the camera, or your subject doesn't move, because that focus is now locked. Well, no matter where I point the camera, because my finger is halfway down on the shutter, it's going to keep that focus point. And then you press it all the way down, and it takes the photograph. So that might seem really basic, but if you're finding one of the things when I worked in the camera shop, what you'd find people were doing is they would be looking at a subject and they would just mash the shutter button down like that. So let's take it out of multi-shot. So they would just go, and they weren't giving the camera enough time to focus. So if, for example, I get the camera to focus on this close subject, right? If I just mash it, so now it's focused quite close. If I want to focus on something that's further away, if I just mash the shutter, it can't do it fast enough, because it wants to refocus, and my subject might have moved. So always think about that. Wait for that beep, and then take the photo. The camera lens has had enough time to focus. Most modern DSLRs do focus incredibly quickly, but follow that little tip, and you may well find that some of the reasons, especially when you're taking photographs of fast-moving subjects such as sports or little kids running around, you've got to do that. So now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about focus and recompose, because we're using the center AF point. But as you probably know, if you've read stuff on books about taking great photographs, is that often you don't want your subject right in the middle. So the problem then is, if our subject isn't in the middle, say we want a picture of a landscape and there's a nice farmhouse. So what we would do is, instead of having the farmhouse in the middle, we'd have it off to one side and down a bit, and then you'd get a pleasing composition using something called the rules of thirds. But as we're aiming, obviously our camera wants to focus what's in the middle, not on the farmhouse down there. So all you do with focus and recompose is you look through, look at the farmhouse, press the button halfway down, so you get the focus lock on the farmhouse, then move the camera up and over, take the picture, so the camera will have stayed focused on that thing in the distance. Now, when you're in most situations, focus and recompose, the slight movement that you give to your camera won't really affect anything. The depth of field, the amount of the subject that is in focus won't be affected by you moving. Now, if you're taking pictures of people though who are very, very close to you and you're using a lens with a very fast aperture, so it's very wide, like an f1.8 or f1.4, it can make a difference, focus and recomposing, but for the purposes of starting off, don't worry about it, just focus and recompose. Now remember though, if you're taking pictures of people or animals or anything that might move, if during that focus and recompose stage they move or you move, you've got to take your finger off the shutter, aim it back at your subject, refocus and recompose as well. Just kind of remember that, and it's a really simple way of doing it. As you get more advanced, what you'll probably find is you will use the other autofocus points in your camera, and you'll be fast enough to flick the button, select say the bottom right hand autofocus point, focus with that and then take the picture. Because what you might come across when you're doing focus and recompose, you might come across slight exposure issues. So what that means is, imagine again it's that farmhouse picture, so there's the farmhouse, bottom right hand corner, and we've got a nice bright blue sky. As we're pointing the camera at the farmhouse, it can't see as much as the bright blue sky, so it sets the exposure as well when we press the button halfway down, so that when we aim the camera to the scene we want, that sky might be a little bit too bright. So what you would then do is you could use your exposure compensation just to knock that exposure down a little bit, or do it in post-processing. But don't worry about it now, you know, for this video we're concentrating on getting sharper photos, so just practice that, practice focusing on something and then moving it away. Now you may be wondering, okay, that's all well and fine for things that are pretty static, that aren't moving, but what happens if something's, say, running past me, or something's coming towards me? You know, what things can I do to take sharper photos? If something's running across your field of vision, then your camera will normally be pretty good, because they're not getting any further or closer away to you, are they? So you can just focus on them and then take the picture. So they're going to be the same distance away. Where it gets a little bit tricky is if they're coming towards you. Imagine a child on a swing, going backwards and forwards, and you want to take a nice picture of them. The problem is every time you try and focus on them, the time it takes the camera to focus, they've swung to a different distance from you, so they're going to be out of focus. So what do? Well, you do a variation on focus and recompose, in the fact that what you do is you wait, say, for them to get to the top of the swing, press the button halfway down, but don't take a picture. The camera will then lock on that position, and then you just wait for them to go back, come forward, and then press the shutter button when they reach that, and then the camera will get it in focus. However, if they're moving too fast so that even when they're swinging you can't get a focus lock, just look, say, right, what's near to them, so maybe there's the bars of the swing, and then just focus on that instead, halfway down, move the camera across, wait for them to come and take the picture. And the final thing you can do, in terms of simple things to do, is just flick your camera to manual focus, and then you manual focus by using the front, look through, wait for them to come to the top of the swing so they're in manual focus, and then when they come back again, take the photo. When you're in manual focus, there's no delay between you pressing the shutter button and the camera taking the picture, because it doesn't try to focus at all. Now, as you get more advanced, what you'll be able to do is, and again, see your manual for this, is use the other focus modes of your camera, i.e. AI lock and AI focus, AI servo, sorry. And what these basically do is they turn your camera into a tracking device as well. So literally, when you press the button, instead of the focus just locking and staying locked in one position, if the subject is moving, so whatever's in the middle is moving, the camera will keep focusing on it as it moves. And so that can be very useful for sports or anything where people are moving. Again, that's a more advanced technique. By all means, practice it and just be careful with it, because if your camera is on, say, focus servo mode, if you're trying to do focus and recompose, when you move the camera, it will then bzz, and it will focus on what's in the distance instead of staying locked on our farmhouse. So just be aware of that. Now, before we move on, let's just take a quick moment to consider the advantage of digital and add that to the mix over our old film cameras. Every photographer, even the most advanced photographer with the best kit, can take a blurred photo. So let's make sure we always take multiple photos of the same scene, especially if it's an important scene. And with digital, because files can be instantly deleted, although you don't do that on your camera. Wait till you get home and do it on your computer on the card. Because in a sense you can take as many photographs as you want, and there's no cost to that after you've bought your camera. Don't be afraid of taking lots and lots of photos. Put your camera into continuous shooting mode, and take lots of photos, because there's this thing that I refer to as photographer's luck, and what it means is that if you want a great photo, you need to take lots of photographs. Think about those scenes, excuse me, got itchy nose. Think about those scenes from films where you see a professional photographer with their camera on motor drive, literally taking lots and lots of photos, because they know that that great photograph is going to be one of those, and it just helps, especially if subjects are moving around or there's tricky lighting conditions and things like that. I talked about it in my last review of a book on National Geographic, but National Geographic photographers in the film days, when they were sent off to assignment and they were going to come back and they were going to have, say, I don't know, 6 or 7 images posted in the magazine, will have taken something like 30,000 images, to get 6 good ones that goes in the magazine. Think about the hit rate. So don't be scared about taking lots of photographs of the same scene to make sure you get one that is really spot on. Okay, so we've talked about how we can make sure we're focusing and using focus and recompose to make sure what we want our camera to focus on is what it's focusing on. Let's talk about the mode we're going to be in. Remember the wife checklist? So we're in aperture priority mode. This is one of the it's one of the automatic modes in our camera. But in aperture priority mode, we control the size of the hole in our lens that lets the light in. And this is really important because it allows us to control the depth of field. And what the depth of field is, it's how much of the scene in front of our camera is in focus. So if that's my camera there, by controlling the size of the hole in the lens, I can say, right, is this bit in focus? Is this bit in focus? Is everything in focus? So it's a real artistic decision we can make there. Think about portraits where you've just the subject and their eyes are nice and sharp and maybe their faces, but everything else is lovely and blurred. Or think about a landscape where everything is beautifully crisp and sharp. And that's what shooting in aperture priority mode gives us. As we're changing the aperture though, the size of the hole in the lens is getting bigger and smaller, and in order to take a photo, a certain amount of light has to come into the camera and hit the sensor or hit the film. So if we've got a smaller hole, we've got less light coming in, which means that we need to keep the shutter open for longer, and that affects our shutter speed, which can change things. And so start thinking about, people refer to it as the exposure triangle. So in order to get an acceptable exposure, we have the size of the hole on the camera that lets the light in, we have how fast the shutter is opening. It doesn't work like this, but imagine it kind of going like that, or like that, and also the ISO, or how sensitive our camera is to light. So let's think about aperture priority and what that means. So if we want a small depth of field, where we've just got a little bit of our scene in focus, say just the head in a portrait, then we'll dial in a small number, say something like f3.5, f2.8, f1.8. The smaller the number, or the smaller the f-stop, the bigger the hole is, and that's because f-stops are expressed in terms of a fraction, so they're actually 2.8. And so if we want more of the scene in focus, what we do is we put a larger number in, which actually is a smaller hole. So say for a nice portrait where you wanted things nice and soft, you might be shooting f3.5, f2.8, 1.8. If you're shooting landscape work where you want lots of the scene in focus, with a digital SLR or an SLR, you're probably looking at like f8, f11, f16, f22. However, do bear in mind that lenses have things called a sweet spot. And what this means is a lens, it's a physical thing, isn't it? It's made out of a series of pieces of glass, and it will be designed to have its best sharpness at a certain f-stop, because a lens can't be just as sharp at every single setting, or even every single zoom length. And so what you tend to find is most lenses are sharpest a couple of stops up from wide open. So if you think of, say, this kit lens as f3.5, it's probably at its best at about f5.6. And in fact, when you get to the very high apertures, say like f22, your images actually start to become softer because of something called refraction or diffraction. I can never remember what it is. So essentially, don't just think, oh, I'm going to get fantastic shot if I always shoot at f16 or f8. You won't, because it could be that your camera actually takes sharper shots at f5.6. And also, as we talked about before, as your aperture gets smaller, so it's letting light in, your camera is going to have a longer shutter speed, which means that you could get blur, which again we're going to talk about in a moment. Now, for everyday handheld shooting on sunniest days, and for photos where I want most of the scene in focus, so you get your subject and lots of the background, I tend to shoot between f5.6 and f8 at probably ISO 200. And if I want to do something with selective focus with this particular lens, I'll go down to f3.5, or I'll put something like my 51.8 in and go down there. Just remember that large apertures are the small f numbers, and also one of the problems with depth of field is that as you get very close to a subject, the depth of field can get very, very small. Now, there's another video in my YouTube stream that talks about depth of field, and you can look at it there. But essentially, if, say, you're trying to do, say, a headshot of somebody, and you're getting very, very close, and you're at a very, very wide aperture, say f1.8 or something like that, your actual depth of field would be very, very, very small. So any movement between the subject, say, moving backwards and forwards, or you moving back and forwards, will lead to a blurry image. So don't worry, when you're very close to somebody, your depth of field will automatically be a lot smaller because of your focal length that you're using. So don't worry about going out to f5.6. You'll probably find the background will still be nice and blurry, but you'll have more of a depth of field to work with to get most of the scene in focus. So have a play around, see what works best with you, and there's a little saying called F8 and B there that photojournalists used to use, and the idea of that is, if you're worried about, don't worry about too much about the settings. If on a sunniest day, if you have your camera set to f8 and put yourself in front of some interesting subjects, you're going to get some great photographs. Okay, so before we go any further, it's worth discussing shutter speed, as this has a massive effect. It's probably the thing that has the most effect on how sharp our photos can be. And as we're in aperture priority mode, we're controlling the size of the hole in the lens that lets the light in. And as that hole gets smaller, less light comes in. So to compensate, the camera has to leave the shutter open longer to let that light in to get an acceptable exposure. The problem is that sometimes, especially if we're hand holding, that shutter speed can get too slow. And when it gets too slow or too long, the small movements that we have as we're holding our cameras will make the photographs blurry or less sharp, and also our subject moving. So it could be a person walking, it could be trees blowing in the wind. They'll become soft as well. So the question is, how do you know? If you've got a bridge camera or compact, it probably warns you. I know my old Fuji used to have a little yellow warning that used to come up in the viewfinder when it thought that the shutter speed was getting a little bit too low, and you would get camera shake. Well, the rule of thumb is, if you look at your zoom lens and look at what distance you're zoomed to, your focal length. So for example, this is an 18 to 55, so I've got 55, 35, 24 and 18. So if I'm at 55, in order to get an acceptably sharp photo when hand holding, and as long as my subject isn't moving very fast, or well, it's basically still, just put a 1 over it and that'll give you an idea. So at 55mm, in order to be able to probably get a sharp photo, to avoid camera shake, I should be shooting at least 1/50th of a second. Okay. If my camera's at 18, well, say 18mm, I should be shooting at least 1/18th of a second or faster. Generally speaking, you want to go faster. So as soon as you start getting down to a 25th of a second, a quarter of a second, you really want to be thinking, actually, I want to be shooting at a faster shutter speed. Now, we also have image stabilization on lots of our lenses, don't we? So that gives us a little bit more elbow room. So you'll probably find if you're shooting a static subject, so something that isn't moving at all, you can shoot at, you know, a 15th of a second, a 20th of a second, no problemo with your lens. However, bear in mind that all that's doing is stopping your camera moving. Well, it's actually moving the elements inside your lens, so it looks like your camera's not moving. If your subject's moving, you know, that's the critical thing for your shutter speed. So I, for example, could have my big zoom lens on and be shooting at 150th of a second, because I'm at, say, 100mm of, say, people running around, and then that would be fine. But I've got my wide angle lens on and I'm shooting at I'm shooting at 18mm, and the shutter speed so goes down to about a 20th of a second, because, you know, the clouds go over the sun or something, but my subjects are running around. Now, just because I'm not getting camera shake doesn't mean I won't get subject movement or subject blur. So start to think about them as separate things, controlling camera shake with shutter speed, and also subject movement or subject blur with shutter speed as well. So the rule of thumbs, if you like, lots of thumbs, for things that are moving, generally, if you're trying to shoot people who are moving around fairly fastly, running around and stuff, you want to be shooting at least 250th of a second. If they're doing sports, so they're running around really vigorously, say a 500th of a second, but say it's motorsports or things flying through the air like air shows and things, probably 1,000th of a second and above. So bear in mind those two things. You know, your shutter speed in terms of camera blur, and then subject movement or subject blur. Now, so what do? So you're out with your camera, the clouds come over, and you're taking pictures of, I don't know, yachts in a boating lake, little boat model yachts going backwards and forwards, and your shutter speed has dropped right down. You know, it's showing you're in aperture priority mode. You've chosen, say, f8 and B there, but your shutter speed has dropped right down to like a 25th of a second, a 10th of a second, and you're thinking, whoa, okay, wait a minute, I might be okay hand holding, but you know, when you look at the pictures on the back of your camera, you notice these little boats are getting blurred. So what do you do? Well, we can adjust the aperture because we're in aperture priority mode, so we can make more light come into the camera. So we do that by opening up the aperture. So we might move from f8, say, to f5.6 to f3.5. That hole's getting bigger, more light's coming in. Now, our depth of field is getting smaller, but as long as we're focusing on things that are fairly far away, that probably isn't going to affect the look of our photo very much at all. If we were doing, say, a landscape shot and we wanted to get something in focus that was very close and something in focus very, very far, obviously if we move to f3.5, then that's going to become less effective. So in that case, you would dig out a tripod and work that way. But there's another option as well. We can adjust the ISO of our camera. Think about the exposure triangle of aperture, ISO and shutter speed. So if we adjust the ISO on our camera, which is how sensitive our camera is to light, that will mean that we can still stay at f8, but our shutter speed will start to double, if you like. So if we were shooting at a 25th of a second and we were at ISO 200 at f8, if we change our shutter speed from 200 to 400, it would then double the shutter speed. So we go from a 25th of a second to a 50th of a second. If we then sort of go up to, say, ISO 800, we could then go to a 100th of a second. and then beyond. Now, what you tend to find is if you're shooting in tricky lighting conditions where the light's going up and down, or it's generally like a grey day, you're probably gonna have to use a combination of increasing your ISO and opening up your aperture to achieve sharper shots. And that's why it's also a good idea when you're taking the photographs and you're looking for the viewfinder. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see, when you're looking through, you'll see your f-stop and your shutter speed, and just make a note of it. You know, if you're shooting a nice scene, a nice landscape scene with our farmhouse and our tree, you know, if your shutter speed is down at, you know, 50th, 25th of a second, doesn't really matter. However, if you're out there shooting pictures of, say, I don't know, windsurfers at the sea, and you're panning and you're following them, for example, or just taking static shots, if your shutter speed is down at a 25th of a second, or even a 50th of a second, you're probably going to get subject blur, because they're going to be moving so fast. So you want to think about increasing your ISO. Again, check your manual to see how to do it, or opening up that aperture to do that way. Now, when you read about things on the web and in books, you'll often read about the fact that low ISOs are better because the photos are less noisy, and as you push up to 400, 800, 1600, 3200, things can become very noisy or grainy. With modern DSLRs, that isn't really the case. I know with my 350D, this is a very old camera now, it's almost due for retirement. Well, I don't think it's ever going to get retired. What I'll probably do is I'll convert it to a infrared camera. Well, this one, for example, it only goes up to ISO 1600 anyway, and it gets a little bit noisy there, but it's acceptable on things that are quite colourful. It looks okay. But the only way you'll know with your camera is by taking test shots. But whatever you do, don't just assume, because you read in an article or on a website that could be several years old, that you should always shoot at near your ISO, or don't go above ISO 800, because with modern digital cameras you can push them to 1600, 3200, 6400, and you're going to get great shots. Which means that in natural light conditions, difficult natural light conditions, you can still get sharp images at tighter apertures, because you can increase your ISO to keep your shutter speed fast. So there we go. But the only way you know is by testing. So what I did was I went down to a local down by the sea and just took several pictures of the same scene at ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600. Had a good look at them on my monitor, you know, at 100%. Never go closer than 100%, because then you just get pixelation. Just to see, you know, what was the real difference. So if I'm in a situation where I really need to push the 1600, you know, would I be happy with the photos? Yeah, I would, definitely. Now, you may come across situations, however, that maybe you're inside, or it starts getting dark, where, you know, you've pushed your ISO up a long way, you've opened up your aperture a long way, and you're hand holding, and you still are getting slow shutter speeds. And really, that's where if you're hand holding and your subjects are fairly close, that's when you're going to start either using your pop-up flash or an external flash. I'm not going to go into it a lot in this video here, but what I will say is that if you are shooting a lot inside, subjects, portraits, that sort of stuff, a fully automatic ITTL or ETTL flash is probably one of the best investments you'll ever make. I would probably say, once you've got you've got a kit lens, say an 18 to 55, and then you've got your telephoto, your 55, say to 250, the next investment you should make is in an automatic flash, because it makes things so much easier. Because obviously when you're inside, you use one of these babies, you can very, very easily bounce the flash off the ceilings or off walls. And when you introduce flash into a scene, you start to really forget about the shutter speed of your camera. It's all about the flash, because the flash is the only thing that's lighting your scene, and the duration of a flash is a very short period of time. But you know, I'm not going to go into that here, but I would just say that, you know, if you're in that situation where your shutter speed is getting too long, you're getting blurred photos, and you've got no other choice, pop up that pop-up flash and start using that. And you'd be surprised, even outside actually, when your subjects can be, you know, 10-15 feet away, that's probably about the limit that your pop-up flash will do. But you know, give it a go and increase your ISO to give it a hand. So there we go. So that's kind of a brief summary of how you should keep an eye on your shutter speed. Just remember, in order to avoid camera shake, just check your focal length. You know, if it's if your shutter speed is faster than that, then happy days. So if you've got your 18 to 55 on, if you're at 35mm, your shutter speed should be at least, you know, a 50th of a second. If it isn't, there's a chance you're going to get camera shake in your photos, so increase your ISO or open up the aperture to let more light in. Okay, chimping, or looking at the photos on the back of your LCD screen. Be very, very aware that anything on the back of here, you can see how old this camera is, how small the screen is, anything back there will probably look an awful lot better than it will on your computer screen. It won't look blurry, it won't look out of focus, the colours will look great. So take with a big pinch of salt anything you see on the back of your screen. Now it's important that you check the back of your screen every now and again when you're taking photographs to make sure you've got the right settings in and things are looking good. But what you need to do is zoom in on your photo. So for example with the 350D, I use these buttons up here and I can zoom in, and that means I can look around and have a good idea whether the photo is sharp or not. And if they are blurred, I can then adjust my aperture, shutter speed or ISO to compensate for that. However, it's important that we do this quickly. Don't get caught into looking at your, taking a photo, click, oh yeah, oh zoom in, yeah, oh yeah, nice. We'll take another photo, oh yeah, oh zoom in. Once you're dialed in and you know that you're a correct shutter speed and aperture where you're getting an ISO, where you're getting nice and sharp photos, trust yourself to move on, because all the time that you're looking down at your screen going, oh yeah, there's probably something else happening up in front of you or over to one side or behind you that you're going to miss. And so make sure that you check, and then once you're happy, carry on shooting. You don't want to miss things that are happening right in front just because you're looking at the back of your camera. So we've covered a lot of ground, but now we should have a really good idea of how to take sharper photos with our DSLRs. We're going to be shooting. We're going to do the wife checklist. We're going to make sure our camera's nice and clean. We're going to be shooting in aperture priority mode. We're probably going to be shooting, if we're out and about in an average day, shooting near our lens's sweet spot, say f6 or f8. We're going to be keeping an eye on our shutter speed to make sure that it doesn't get too long. We're going to be using focus and recompose to make sure that we're focusing, using that center autofocus point on the thing we want to focus on, focusing on that, and then moving our composition and taking the picture. And if the light starts to change and our shutter speed starts to drop or change, we're going to keep an eye on our focal length, so we know that at certain points, if it drops below our focal length, that we could get camera shake. And if our subject's moving around nice and fast, we're going to understand that we need to be shooting around about a 250th for moving people, 500th if they're doing sports, and over 1,000th of a second for motorsports, aeroplanes and that sort of thing. We're going to be probably shooting in continuous mode, or well, we're not going to be scared at taking 2 or 3 shots of the same scene, because we're going to be relying on photographer's luck, and there's nothing wrong with that, to make sure that we've got a fighting chance of getting a sharp shot. We're going to check our LCD screens and zoom in to have a quick chimp to make sure they're okay, but then we're going to be moving on and we're going to be taking lots and lots of photographs. And essentially that's it. That's all you really need to practice when you're out and about taking photographs outside. What we're going to do next is I'm going to talk about some more advanced techniques that you could use to get your photos even sharper. Okay, so how to hold the camera. 350D is a nice lightweight camera. I could hold this all day. When I put the 55 to 250 on it, it's a little bit heavier. But you always want a nice firm grip on the grip, and think of your body as as a bit of a tripod. So for example, the way I like I shoot, I tend to have my left leg slightly forward, with my right leg slightly back, with my feet kind of out at right angles. equidistant, so bend your knees a little bit so you're kind of ready to go. This is the arm that's taking almost all of the weight of the camera, and I tuck my elbow in on my big fat belly, so that's almost like a little monopod. And then I can focus and I can shoot and I can change the angle of the camera. Really, really, really simple. Everything is nice and secure. I haven't got my elbows out waggling around. Everything's nice and tight and relaxed and calm, and you can change your position, you can move around, and you're not wobbling around, and you're nice and safe. You can bring breathing technique in as well to taking sharper photographs. And what that's all about is, it comes from rifle shooting and archery, is that what you want to be doing is pressing the shutter button when you're breathing out, when you're relaxed. So it's in, and then when you breathe out, then press the shutter button. So it's kind of, as I'm breathing out, I'm pressing the shutter button, and I'm taking the photo. Also, what you can also practice, instead of pressing the shutter button, like jabbing at it, when you've got your button finger halfway down on the shutter button, instead of like pressing it over, roll your finger like that, and that will put less movement into your camera, when you're holding. When we're talking about that as well, make sure that you're dressed appropriately for when you're out and about. So if it's very, very cold, obviously you'll start to shake anyway, so make sure you're warm, you've got gloves on if necessary. You can get the ones with 2 fingers you can take out. Unless you don't want to be too hot either, you don't want to be sweating and have slippy hands, so your camera's going to be slipping all over the place. You can see that I'm wearing an R-strap, a bandana, not a bandana, a kind of cross-chest type of strap. I find these incredibly comfortable. I know that I can wear my camera like this, even with the big lens on, all day, rather than the ones that go around your neck, and put it on there. So, you know, I'm going to be fitter and more ready to shoot. A really good technique that you can use is, we've talked about taking lots of photographs, but let's say you're in a situation where your shutter speed is getting quite long. You know, you're up at half a second, really long shutter speeds, but you've got no choice. You know, you're kind of stuck there. In order to give yourself a fighting chance of getting at least one sharp photo, go into burst mode, go into continuous drive mode, and take lots of photos in a row. And chances are, if you take sort of 10-20 photos of the same subject, although most of them might be blurred because your shutter speed is so long, there's a good chance some of them could be sharp, and so you can bin the ones that are rubbish and do the ones that are sharp. Another good time to do that actually is when you're doing, say, portraits of people, and you're using a very wide aperture, f1.8, f2.8, f1.4, and you're quite close, and that literally the depth of field will be, you know, probably less than a centimetre, and with you just naturally moving backwards and forwards and your subject actually moving backwards and forwards, chances are that plane of focus is going to change. Again, in that case, you know, take lots of photos, go backwards and forwards, because chances are one of those will then hit the sweet spot of being in focus. And you'd be better off that way. I talked about it earlier, but see your manual. Understand how you can change the autofocus points on your camera. So instead of using that centre one, use one of the ones off to one side, so that you don't have to focus and recompose in certain situations. Personally, I always focus and recompose. I very rarely use the other autofocus point unless my camera's on a tripod and I can't move it. Read your manual about the servo and tracking autofocus modes, because these are really good for sports, sports, aeroplanes and people. You know, when people are moving around, moving backwards and forwards, so that when you press the shutter button, the camera keeps focusing backwards and forwards rather than locking off. But just bear in mind that then if you recompose, you're going to lose the focus on the main thing. Practice manual focusing. In tricky light conditions, your autofocus will often fail or not get it right. Or maybe you've got lots of, say you're trying to shoot through a screen of somebody, or maybe there's plants hanging down. Your camera will just focus on the wrong thing. Flick your camera to manual focus and do it that way. You know, photographers did it for 100 years before autofocus came down. But remember, when you are autofocusing, make sure your diopter is set correctly, otherwise you're going to be starting off from the wrong point. I talked about f8 and B there earlier, and that also comes from the idea of hyperfocal distance. And what that means is, with your camera and your lens, at a certain focus point, so when it's focusing somewhere on the scene, at some point everything beyond that and a little bit before that will be in focus. And generally the tighter the aperture, so the larger the f number, the closer that will be to the camera. So if you're at f8, for example, you can probably focus a third of the way into the scene. So if you're doing a landscape shot, focus something a third of the way to the horizon, and probably lots of the stuff before that and almost everything behind that will be in focus. So you could even do that, go to manual focusing, and excuse me, getting a bit of a dry throat, and then you wouldn't have to worry about focusing at all. That could be important in a run and gun situation. Most autofocus on cameras now is so fast though that you probably wouldn't bother doing that. Other things you can do as well, lean against something. Say there's a post or a pillar. If you lean against it, you can stabilise your camera. Put your camera on top of the wall. Use a beanbag. Use your camera bag. I don't use them very often, but they are incredibly useful. Use a tripod. Got my old EOS 600 film camera on this. You can pick these up very cheap at car boot sales and thrift shops. What you're paying for generally with tripods is how sturdy they are with heavy gear on, but for most entry-level stuff, even the cheap tripods are okay, and as you start spending more money, they get lighter. So this is an old Velbon aluminium one, solid as a rock really, fantastic bit of kit. You get bowl heads, you get three-way pan and tilt heads, you get video heads. When you get your tripod, just use it lots, and what you find is you then become very quick with it. Sometimes they can be quite limiting in terms of, once you've set up, if you need to then go somewhere else, you've got to sort of fold it up and carry it somewhere else. But what they will give you is that they take the issue of camera blur completely away, because the camera's going to be locked down on the tripod. If a tripod is say too big and bulky, or some situations you're not allowed to use tripods at all, say sports events or in museums and things, think about a monopod. These are very good. It's just like one leg of a tripod. It's screwed into the bottom, and that gives me a really nice stable base from which to shoot with, and I can move that around. It's very light, you could fit it in your knapsack, no problem at all. I picked this one up again cheap. I think I got it from another car boot sale. Don't use it very much, to be brutally honest, because I don't shoot sports or really go to places where you're not allowed to take a tripod. I tend to, if I'm in a situation where I'll need to use longer shutter speed, that means I need to use a tripod, I won't use the monopod. I'll use the tripod instead. But another option, when your camera is on the tripod, you can still move it when you're pressing the button. So consult your camera manual and look up how to use the self timer. The delay timer, so then you press the button, the camera will wait 2 or 10 seconds and then take the picture, because you're not pressing the camera when it goes off. Also mirror lockup. If you turn mirror lockup, what happens is when you take a picture, the mirror jumps out of the way, and that can make the camera shake just a tiny little bit. Turn mirror lockup on, and what will happen is when you take the picture, the mirror will flick up straight, then it will take the picture, then it will come down afterwards. So the physical act of the mirror moving doesn't make the camera shake. And obviously, simplest way, get a remote, so you're not even touching the camera at all. They're very useful, especially if you're into doing portrait shots. When you're doing manual focusing with old lenses as well, say old M42 lenses, it's very tempted to always shoot at shooting wide open. So you can use something called stopping down, so that's where you manually change it. But that also comes to our more modern cameras as well, in the fact that you may well be taking photos and say doing a portrait shot where you want the background nice and blurry, or when you're looking through the viewfinder, you're doing a landscape shot and things seem blurry when you don't want them to be. And that's because whenever you're looking through the viewfinder, the camera always has the maximum aperture. So in this scene, it doesn't, this lens, it doesn't matter what I set in. If I set it to f8 or f16, when I'm looking through there, it's still wide open at f3.5. If I want to preview the depth of field, you've got to press this little button here, and that will close up the aperture. You won't be able to see it, I don't think. You might be able to see that going back, closing up. And then when you look through, you get a true idea of what the depth of field will be in the picture. The problem with that is if you find it can go very dark, so you can't really see what you're doing. And I guess to kind of finish off this little section, one of the big things that can affect the sharpness of your photos is the quality, I guess, of the lens that you're using. More expensive lenses are better than cheaper lenses, but you'd be surprised at how little a difference there actually is, especially when you're at the lens's sweet spot. I reckon that with probably my favourite lens, my 55 to 250, I reckon that this lens, when it's at like, I don't know, f8, is as sharp as any other lens out there. It takes fantastically sharp images. Nothing could be as sharp. However, what you'd probably find is like the Canon 70 to 200 will be just as sharp at f2.8. And the image stabilization will be much better. So don't chase the dream of my photos will be sharper if I spend more money on lenses. It's just as easy to take a blurry photo with a very expensive lens as it is with a cheap one, and you can take just as sharp photos with cheaper lenses that you can with more expensive ones, as long as you know your kit, how it works and how to get the best out of it. You might also argue that the quality of your body as well, the camera body could affect how sharp your photos are, but I'm not convinced by that like that. I'm pretty sure that my 350D with an L lens on is just as sharp as a 1DN with an L lens on. There won't be as much detail there because the sensors is a lot less. And what you tend to find is that the more expensive lenses and the more expensive cameras are better in more extreme conditions. So they're much better in low light, or they're much better in bad weather. Whereas, for amateurs like myself and probably most people watching the video, I like going out and taking photos on lovely sunny days and things like that. So, that's when my camera is going to be getting the best images as well. Okay, so we've got some photos in our camera. One of the last bits in the puzzle, if you like, of taking sharp photographs is post-processing. And this is why I kind of said at the beginning, let's shoot JPEGs, because when you shoot JPEGs, your camera applies things like sharpening and contrast and saturation to your images, and so they're pretty much good out of the camera. And all you probably really need to do if you do shoot JPEGs is probably boost the contrast a little bit, maybe increase the saturation a little bit, and you don't need to do much else. However, if you do feel the need to add sharpening, most software, even things like free software like Picasa, will have a sharpening tool, and it will apply it globally, so it will apply it to the whole photo. And things like Lightroom and Photoshop and again, you can apply sharpening locally, so to say just the eyes. And you could use things like unsharp mask, high pass filters, that sort of thing. You can do a search on the web for how to do sharpening. However, bear this in mind. You should only sharpen based on what the final output of the photograph will be, and you should never sharpen your originals. The reason for that is that if you want to show something on a website, imagine the difference between a big screen and then a little screen. You're going to need different amounts of sharpening. You need different amounts of sharpening if you're going to print it out. And there's few things that are worse than an over-sharpened image when you kind of start getting those halos around the edges of things and you get noise appearing in sky and stuff like that. So generally, don't worry about sharpening too much. Most people, in fact, I'd probably say everybody apart from photographers, don't really worry about sharpening. They just don't see it. If a photo's really blurred, they go, oh, that's a blurred photo, isn't it? And you go, actually, I meant it to be like that. But photographers are the worst ones for seeing a perfectly acceptable, perfectly nice photo, looking at 100% and say, well, actually, the eyes aren't tack sharp or something like that. When your average person who is going to consume that photo, who's going to enjoy it, just don't care. So don't spend too much. Don't worry, don't sweat it too much about sharpening, and if you are going to sharpen, just sharpen on what the output will be, whether that be whether you're going to print it, do it on the web. I very rarely apply any sharpening anymore to my photos, because when I first started doing it, I was very guilty of applying too much, and I find that shooting in JPEG mode, they're perfectly good enough for what I need. So there we go, that's the video. We've covered a lot of ground. I hope it's been helpful. And although we've spent a lot of time talking about different techniques for getting ultra sharp photos, don't get too het up about it. If you use some of these techniques and involve them in your sort of shooting workflow, they will become natural, and you won't be chasing the technical in order to avoid the artistic. And remember what I said at the beginning, there's nothing worse than a really sharp photo of a fuzzy idea. That's not my quote, I think it was Ansel Adams said that. And just remember that 90% of the world's greatest photos, they're not tack sharp. No, it's all about capturing that moment, the decisive moment of Henri Cartier-Bresson. Okay, so hopefully this video has been of use. Please send me feedback, scalespeeder@gmail.com. You'll see it at the end of the video. If you really like it, head on over to robnonphoto.com, and there's a little PayPal link where you can make a donation, buy me a coffee or something like that. Similarly, if there's things that you've thought I've missed out, you can add them into the comments, either on the website or on the YouTube channel. I hope you enjoy what I've done, and if you want to see any more videos as well of different subjects, send me an email, and I can record videos that way. Well, there we go. My name's Rob from robnonphoto.com. Thanks for watching.